So welcome to this research roadmap panel. My name is Steffen Staab. I'm affiliated with University of Stuttgart and University of Southampton. I have the honor to chair this panel, and we have a fantastic set of panelists. And I want to very quickly introduce them to you. I will leave away most of the accolades that they have accumulated over the year. That would take too long. So just 2 sentences about each one. And I will give that in the speaking order, which we will have. So the first one to speak will be Fabien Gandon. He is research director and vice head of research for INRIA, Sophia Antipolis Mediterranee. He's both a semantic web and a web science visionary, as well as a practitioner who puts the rubber on the road and guides projects to completion. Then we will have Bettina Berendt. She is professor for Internet and Society at the Technical University Berlin and director of the Weizenbaum Institute. One might say the German Internet Institute. She has been working on privacy, fairness, and AI ethics long before these terms were fashionable. And I always love chatting to her because she always makes me revise a point of view that I held before. Then we will have Dr. Carolyn Nguyen. She's a director of technology policy at Microsoft. And I'm probably very bad with the pronunciation. Sorry, Carolyn, for that. Carolyn has been working with OECD, United Nations, World Economic Forum, and the likes in order to encourage an evidence-based approach to policy, something we truly need today. She cares deeply about education and bringing all relevant groups to the table to bring issues forward. Then we will have Professor Noshir Contractor. He's professor in 3 schools at Northwestern University, which emphasizes his interdisciplinary upbringing. Coming from electrical engineering, he has now been investigating social and knowledge networks for a very long time, and with great successes, leading to many laurels by learned associations. So a great set of panelists. Let me introduce to you briefly what led to this specific research panel. And that started a while ago, namely 2 years ago, with a Adactual Perspectives workshop, where we celebrated 10 years of web science. And the Perspective workshop was also meant to think ahead into the future. What are the research challenges, the societal challenges that we have to face? Now, from that workshop, it took forever in order to put together a Adactual manifesto. And today we open it to the public 2 years later after the workshop took place. And you find it on the webscience.org, or when you go to my Twitter account at @ststab, and you can download it. And actually the plan is that Bettina and Fabien, they will both present parts, tiny excerpts from the manifesto according to their current view, because the world has changed since when we finally finished it, which was at the beginning of March, a different world than now. And but then we also invited people who were half on the outside. So Noshir was at this event then 2 years ago, but didn't contribute to the writing. And he has interesting points to add to that. And Carolyn wasn't at that event, and we really look forward to see her views on what we put together. A core ingredient of what we put into the manifesto was the ambiguity that the web exhibits. So we see this particularly since we finished the manifesto, when Corona came up, and we see all the problems that this emphasizes. We have in the web information freedom, and which is good because we can easily access information with a few mouse clicks. But then, and this is highlighted by Corona, we have an issue with information quality. There's a lot of bad advice out there from all kinds of actors. And there are many more issues we delved in. But now I don't want to take time from the panelists and rather hand over to the panelists. The overall idea is that each panelist will have 5 minutes for her or his statement. Then we take a few minutes questions that you have from the audience immediately or from the other speakers. And then we move on to the next speaker. So we will not go like 20 minutes, but maybe like 3, at most 5 minutes of questions that follow up immediately on what was said. And then we will have time for a longer discussion. Please use the Q&A facility of your Zoom interface. The chat will also be open. I will primarily look into the Q&A, but then also try to track the chat capability. So our first speaker will be Fabien. And Fabien, I look forward to your statement.
Thank you, Steffen. So thank you very much for the nice introduction and also for introducing the manifesto. The part of the manifesto I'm going to be mentioning here is the part of seeing the web as a way to link all kinds of intelligence. So we now have a web of everything on everything, meaning that on the web, we describe and link anything that can be identified. And we access this description from a variety of connected devices. These two trends, the web of everything and the web on everything, they are both viral and synergistic. So we need more and more intelligence on the web to help us manage, search, control, and in general, use and not misuse all these resources linked on the web. So we need AI web robots, but we need these AI agents to be benevolent by design. We must ensure that AI brings no harm to the web users. We need these AI agents to be resilient to the web, its heterogeneity, the different scales and speeds, the noise we can find, the open nature of the web, its uncertainty, and so on and so on, all the difficulties and dangers of the web. And inversely, we need to become more and more AI friendly. We need to extend the web architecture, its standard, to turn the web into an environment fully supporting the hosting of AI agents in a distributed way, because we don't want things to be re-centralized, and with all the diversity of AI methods possible. In addition, and beyond the connection of individual intelligences to the web, we are also looking at forming large heterogeneous hybrid communities on the web. So for this, we need to bring together the architecture of distributed AI, for instance, multi-agent system on one side, and the architecture of the web. And then we need to support hybrid communities to support the formation of groups of humans and artificial agents and their interaction with this group to achieve their goals. This in turn requires to ensure the best user experience in that context by designing advanced human AI interaction on the web, and at the same time by assisting human web interaction using AI methods. In that context, an important sub-problem will be to build trust and support decision-making for all types of users we can find on the web. This means in particular the ability to provide user-friendly explanation, justification, traces of AI activities on the web. And these hybrid communities will also require new social contract. They will have to support the establishment and the enforcement of social rules governing both human and artificial agent behaviors. So the web has the potential to link all forms of intelligence for better and for worse. And we need to address all these challenges and many more if we want the web to go in the direction of supporting online intelligence augmentation. And that would be my starting statement.
Thank you very much, Fabien. We will take immediate questions if there are. My question would be, how can we ensure benevolent behavior of agents? Is it even clear what benevolence is?
So it's gonna, I am guessing it's going to be one of the key questions in that panel, because as soon as we talked about benevolent agent, we are also touching on cultural aspects. What does it mean to be benevolent? It can be highly dependent on the culture or the user you are considering. What I would put first is that I believe there are things that are benevolent with regard to the web philosophy itself. So the way the web was designed was, for instance, to allow everyone to say everything about anything. That's one of the core characteristics of the web architecture. And so a benevolent agent for the web should be an agent, for instance, that respects or even enforce that, helps people to enforce that characteristic. But of course, I wouldn't be able to tell you all the benevolent agent possible, and I would certainly not believe that any benevolent agent I would design would be considered as benevolent by someone else on the other side of the planet.
So Ian asked an interesting question. Will we need agents that monitor and police the activities of other agents? And how will we delegate authority for these agents?
Yes, in the Dutch tool manifesto, many participants raised the fact that whether an agent is designed to detect a bias in some data that are published, or an agent is able to detect that another agent is spamming or is creating fake content, all these will be also cases for us to try to build reporting agents, for instance, that report to us when they detect something is wrong in terms of content or behavior on the web. Yes, that was clearly one of the scenario identified during the Dutch tool seminar.
And it's a very current question, right? So we just had these days that the MIT people who collected the images, they had to pull their image collection because it included too much bad bias about words you wouldn't want to use and you wouldn't want to associate with people on which you train your image recognizer, right? So already with the data, the problem of benevolence starts.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so let us switch to our second speaker, Bettina.
Okay, hello. Sorry. I just need to change my backgrounds. Right, thanks, Steffen. Thanks, Fabien. I would like to start right where you left off, namely with the benevolence, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges for web governance that we have discussed, this assumption that we are the good ones and that we know what is good. And even Steffen had that slightly in his slides with the nice ambiguities in red and green, which very clearly culturally signals what is good and what is bad. And I think what we should never forget when we do web governance, meaning how do we regulate what happens on the web, how the web evolves, how we actually all get along in this space, is that whatever we do, we will need to balance different rights, different viewpoints. And one person's misinformation is another person's free speech. So does that become a completely relativistic standpoint? No. I very much believe in red lines, but it is one of the hardest things to do in governance offline as much as online. And what we also, when we do that, I mean, of course, that happens in all realms of life, but when we talk about the web, we need to take into account the context of web speech that just travels so much faster at so much greater speed, that has so much more impact. It can be in misinformation, it can be in hate speech. And how we're putting that into laws, we discussed a couple of examples in the manifesto. How we put that into social norms is very much an open and continuous question. So now I've slashed all the human agents on the web as being problematic, but there's also the artificial agents that Fabien so nicely introduced. And so what is actually, they are first-class citizens on the web technologically, all those chatbots. But should they be the same legally? What rights would they have? What duties would they have? Who would be responsible, liable, and accountable? Or what would be that? That is being actively discussed with regard to revisions of laws at the moment. And again, it will be an ongoing challenge. And in the course of that, humans and human institutions and artificial institutions, artificial agents to some extent have amassed lots of power, and we have huge power differentials that arguably are growing by the day. Do we want to get rid of power? Can we get rid of power? No. But we can draw on the history of how we learn to deal with power differentials in offline life. And we need on the web, as much as elsewhere, justice and strong institutions. And we take inspiration here from the UN's Sustainable Development Goals that call for just that and recognize how important it is to uphold all the other values that we hold dear. Finally, and that's probably the least controversial of that, the web is a global thing. We need global collaboration. Or do we? That is what we wrote in March. And we wrote in that global challenge, there needs to be a continuous renegotiation of structures and processes. And then Corona happened and we got this whole discussion back to the table, global and local. On the one hand, everybody calls for global getting together to solve these issues, to be solidaric and so on. On the other hand, there's a big reemergence of local thinking. Wouldn't local solutions be more resilient? Wouldn't they allow us better keep our sovereignty and uphold those democratic values that we hold dear? This very software on which we speak is a case in point. Zoom has become a lifeline for many of us in that time. At the same time, some institutions ban it. And I don't need to tell you what the discussion here is, but this tension is going to stay with us in the questions of web governance for a while to come. And then another thing that I found very interesting is words that had always had a certain connotations all of a sudden seemed to change and seemed to call for redefinition. And so, for example, Yuval Harari said in an interview with CNN in March, we need to protect and police borders between humans and the virus, and not those between nation states, which of course is what basically happened. And so police and border was suddenly newly definable terms. And the UN task force published a report 3 days ago on a One Health approach to attacking root causes of corona instead of just doctoring around at the symptoms, where they argue we need to look at human health and animal health and planet health together, and we can only reach it together very close to sustainable development in thinking. And they conclude we need investment in surveillance and coordinated human, animal, environmental health services. So, wow, surveillance is all of a sudden something positive. And you can see where each of these words gets a specific meaning for web scientists to act. And so while I think there's a lot of truth in that, we have to be careful to not throw out the baby with the bathwater and, for example, say it's not the case that just because we're surveilling non-human things, this doesn't affect humans and this doesn't affect fundamental and human rights. And the nice interrelationship highlighted there brings me back to Fabien's Web of Intelligences. And I'd like to mirror a discussion that actually started, yesterday, I guess, that the World Health Organization said, well, contact tracing apps haven't been the game changer that we expected them to be. And then seeing press echoes today, and there was one article that I thought was very interesting. They said, we do seem to have a problem of trust in the institutions. It's not a technological thing here. But what is good about this whole discussion about the contact traces that we've had, we have learned what contact tracing is. We have learned that it works when humans do that and when there's resources being dedicated to that. We have rediscovered the importance of privacy, arguably, but there's been a lot of very ironic twists and turns in that area. And we have gained well-made and ultimately functioning tracking and tracing apps, which may yet prove their merit because there may be new waves coming. And what is positive for us as web science, and I think that is really the take-home message I want to give, web science is actually implicated in and can contribute to all of these. The human contact tracers are essential, but they upload their results on the internet. And all the other steps there centrally involve web science in one way or other, and it's a big challenge for us to define governance structures and develop technology here. And with that, I want to give over to Carolyn, who will tell us more about trust, governance, and many other things.
Thank you very much, Bettina. Maybe some people have some immediate questions they want to, then we can get hold of that. And I have an immediate question. I want to jump in. Now, you put up really huge questions, Bettina, which is great. But I wonder, I mean, when we think about international collaboration, I think internationally we were doing very well with regard to technical standards, yeah. Protocols for telecommunications, protocols for internet, protocols for how to deal with ship traffic, international regulation of the seas. So all these kind of more technical issues seem to work very well with international collaboration. I see much less success when it comes to administrating and regulating values. Yeah, what kind of values are in freedom of speech and in showing certain kind of information and in these kind of things. And I see much less traction in the offline world in these matters. And do you have any hope or why would you have any hope that we would succeed in the web in being successful there?
I think I do have hope. Let me give you a little bit of a roundabout answer. There is a collection by the NGO Algorithm Watch of AI ethics guidelines, which I think is growing by the minute, and they have collected far more than 100 of these guidelines by now. So we can't say there's no interest. There is also a recent very useful overview of where do these guidelines overlap, which values do they all hold dear. That's also very helpful, and you see a lot of actually, let's say, overlap and agreement there. But this is territory that's not familiar for engineers. It's very political, and some of these things cannot be solved in an engineering way. So there will be this tension, and contention will continue, and there needs to be a translation to actual measures and actual designs and so on. And we have all the problems of engineering and all the problems of how do different people understand values, especially people who are not used to arguing about values, and how do we put values into technology, which is so hard. And I would start with the successful examples where with the GDPR, we have the legal mandate to do privacy by design and by default, and an industry is springing up around this. How can we make this concrete? How can we make this understandable and actionable to engineers? And I see a lot of development there, a lot of discussion, and I'm absolutely amazed how things that we've been talking about for 10, 20, 30 years have now reached general consciousness with the discussion of these Corona tracker architectures. People wouldn't have talked about decentralized and centralized things a year ago, right? And so I think we need to stay with these concrete things, have these concrete discussions, bring that into the curriculum, which we're doing. I'm just finishing a really, really wonderful course with my students, which has been fully online and fully ethical on all these different questions. To see also how can we then at some points also say we've succeeded here. And I think in the end, we will say the whole, that's my hope, the whole Corona traces discussion will at one point be a successful example of how we got together, how we talked about values, how we put them into architectures, and how we lived with differences in opinions. Mm-hmm. Because we still have those, because some countries favor this and other countries favor that. Mm-hmm. And we still get on and look for interoperability between these things. So I see progress.
Yeah. There's one very interesting comment and one question by the audience. I would take both mm-hmm. before we proceed to Carolyn. So the comment by Lucy Huberman is really interesting because it basically says the conventional architecture for tracing has been starved for money, and yes. Now the apps are basically trying to patch up something which misses a crucial component, namely exactly the local people who sort of like contact people, who talk to them, who convey the importance of what they're doing, and the app alone cannot really do that. I think it's a really good comment made by Lucy. And there's a question that to you, I think, Bettina, are you suggesting a local regional web with on-off ramps versus a globally agreed web structure with competing cultural legal approaches?
The internet is the net of nets, network of networks, isn't it? We have some architectural past here. What is an on-off ramp in this context? Steffen, help me understand the question.
So I think to me, it sounds a bit like a national infrastructure, like Schengen as a physical place is a place where you can roam freely within. But on the outside, of course, you have to cross a boundary. There are certain kind of protocols and limitations. And the question might be whether that's how the web will become. Yeah. And of course, we know Wendy and Kieron had this nice piece on the 4 internets. That exactly points in that same direction. We will have these kind of local webs which will be governed by different policies and different accesses.
That is a very good and also very important question. And I've read some policy documents in the past week. Again, I'm sorry, I'm always coming back to the Tracer app things because there's so much happening in that space. I think what that discussion brings back is discussions about, and I called that national sovereignty with regard to, let's say, software infrastructure, hardware infrastructure that has been a bit buried for a while in this global dream. And now, of course, everybody's is very careful. Nobody wants to have an authoritarian regime that says, here's our internet, and I'm sorry, not internet, web, to the second anonymous attendee. Here's our web, and please stay out, and please don't go into the other bad outside things. And I think it's still, the judgment is still very much out on how we will work on that. I think, and what would be my, let's say, hope for the future would be a lot more interoperability that complements certain things that maybe are better done locally with those that are done locally in other contexts. And in a sense, a real coexistence, because we do see that if we just go for one global thing, this comes with a big push for monopolistic power. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking economics here. And I think we're seeing the problems of that more strongly all the time. On the other hand, the very local schemes are very often very nationalistic or well, even worse, parochial. So it needs to be, I mean, we were mirroring what we see in the world in other realms as well. We're mirroring that we need to get on in our neighborhood, in our city, in our state, in our country, and at the same time at the level of the planet, in where we have the UN and we have these organizations that talk to each other, hopefully, at all of these levels. And I think we need something like that in order to be resilient and to really function and go towards the future.
Okay, I think that's the perfect handover to Carolyn, who is really actively working in this direction.
Wonderful.
Thank you again for your first answers. We will see more of you. But let's hand over to Carolyn and your statement.
Thank you, Steffen, and thank you, Fabien and Bettina and everyone else. And for the opportunity, I'm just thrilled to be invited to join this really important discussion on shaping the web futures to be inclusive, intelligent, and sustainable. In some ways on this panel, and I shared this with Steffen and my fellow panelists yesterday in a pre-call, I stick out a little bit like a sore thumb because I'm coming at it from a different perspective. Love the manifesto because of how you raise really important and relevant issues. Just to set the context a little bit for my comments, they are from the perspective of my work in policy development globally. And so what I'm sharing is my observations on what are some of the needs of that community from the researchers that can help to shape the web future. I'm talking to researchers, so I'm taking the prerogative that I can ask lots of questions without having to provide any answers, because that's what you're all really good at. As many have pointed out, this discussion is extremely timely. COVID-19 has shown us that digital technology in general, and the web specifically, is an essential and integral part of our lives. The good as well as the bad and the fissures have been amplified. COVID-19 arrived when there was an overwhelming techlash. That technology is bad. But there's now, I think, an increasing awareness of the use of technology for good, as well as how technology can be used to counter the bad. These are discussions that are not really part of the normal policy discussions. So just a few examples of use of technologies to counter or mitigate the bad. Use of technology to verify and elevate accurate information. Use of technology to detect cyber criminals activities related to COVID-19. Use of technology to examine internet traffic and connection that can lead to impact in terms of integrity of elections, in particular, malicious activities and attempted intrusions by foreign adversaries or criminals. COVID-19 has also laid bare some pre-existing issues, and I'll just pick two. One is the global digital divides, and this is why I thought it was so prescient of you to bring up the inclusive web. So an often quoted statistics is that about 3.7 billion people around the world don't have internet access, but do we actually have accurate information on where they are? In the US, what we did was we used alternative data to show that about 163 million people in the US don't have access versus 25 million according to official record from the FCC. And this has led to FCC and congressional action. So this is what additional use of data can do, but data is only one part of the solution. What are other social cultural barriers for getting on the web? How can the web truly be a positive resource for everyone, regardless of their abilities? So this talks about accessible solutions, their capabilities, their economic status, etc. So how can everyone truly participate and contribute insights, which is absolutely needed in order to get to the futures that you've laid out? A second issue which is laid bare by COVID-19 is skills. Global unemployment in 2020, according to our estimate, can reach about 250 million people. But the biggest burden is on those with lower educational attainment, people with disabilities, other disadvantaged groups such as women, younger workers, people with less formal education. It's not about offering more online courses. How can data help to better define the problems what are the social cultural barriers to moving to new jobs? What are the stigma associated with that? What are the new skills in demand? What are some learning paths that can be shared, especially for those that drastically transition to new paths? We took a stab at this, or LinkedIn did, in terms of making the LinkedIn economic graph data available, but that's only one part of the solution. In the true web science case, we need sociologists, we need everyone at the table. So as COVID-19 has shown, it's abundantly clear that shaping the web futures need to be an interdisciplinary dialogue. And I want to take that apart a little bit, but it also needs to be an ongoing dialogue for the web to be sustainable. There's different dimensions of interdisciplinary, engineers, data scientists, sociologists, economists, even lawyers, right? But also journalists and subject matter experts, because you have a view that says AI needs to augment human ingenuity. That means that you need subject matter experts at the table. Doctors need to figure out how to look at models that have come up, that AI has come up with, to say, that doesn't make sense. You need to go back again. Otherwise, human needs to be a part of the loop, but human needs to understand the technology as well. Another dimension, multi-stakeholder, business, government, technical community, academic research, civil society, trade unions, people, normal people need to be at the table. Different communities, we kind of made fun of this a little bit yesterday. There's the web science community. There's also the privacy community, the internet governance community. They're all having different vocabularies, as Bettina pointed out, different cultures. This is absolutely critical if you're going to have a global discussion to shape the web. However, bringing lots of people into the same dialogue is difficult. If you have a hammer, everything is a nail. Regulators want regulation, and anything that is not understood, that's new, is bad and needs to be regulated, especially technology. Academics want to publish papers and move on to the next new thing, as opposed to going into the level to say, how do you actually implement this thing in a way that works? Privacy is a great example. So you talk about web governance. In the internet governance space, we talk about internet governance of the internet and internet governance on the internet. Now, from my perspective, a major achievement in the internet governance dialogue in the last 20 years is actually to raise awareness of the importance of multi-stakeholderism as a viable alternative to multilateralism. In other words, everyone needs to be at the table. And it's really nice to see this starting to be recognized at the UN, in particular the United Nations, the Secretary General's recent roadmap for digital cooperation, as well as other bodies. So thank you, Web Science, for pushing this forward, but please keep on pushing. The research questions, which are really still difficult to collect data on, would include what are the basic forms of multi-stakeholderism, which form is most effectively applied for what types of issues to encourage what kinds of outcomes, how to prepare people to engage effectively in interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder dialogues. What are the ways to encourage more interdisciplinary multi-stakeholder research activities? When I talk to a lot of specialists, they say, what's the appropriate reward structure? A legal scholar doesn't get credit for publishing in a computer science journal or vice versa. So there are some really, really basic issues, practical issues. If we agree that shaping the web futures need everyone at the table, then a fundamental issue is trustworthiness of the web. Trustworthiness, not trust. Yes, it's an old boring problem, but there's still not a lot of practical information on this. What properties does a system need to exhibit to gain trust from people, from the collective? Is there a difference there? What is the technical architecture of trust? Shared infrastructure, interoperability, tools monitoring, I think is only part of this. How can technologies be developed to mitigate risk? Internet of Things increases the surface of attacks, but this also means additional signals are available to detect attacks. What is a data architecture that can demonstrate its provenance, find related data, etc.? Bettina brought up the issue of interoperability, which is incredibly important because there is not one single web. How can relevant related data find each other, cross national borders? etc. What does it mean to build a context-aware system? What are the elements that would need to consider situational context, demographics, culture, perceptions? Human-machine AI interactions, as Fabien mentioned, is absolutely critical. How to achieve individual trust and collective trust? What's the balance there? So there's a lot of talk about AI. I'd like to use AI policy development as a specific example to bring some concrete elements to my comments above. Over the last 2 years, I've been working to shape the development of AI to deliver its potential proactively. So here we have an issue where we can be proactive as opposed to with the web where there's already an existing mechanism, organism that needs to be shaped. With AI, the potential issues with using data analytics had been identified early on. The 2012 case of Target identifying a teenager as being pregnant, on and on it goes. So this led to a global discussion on AI ethics. Part of that, whose ethics? Who gets to make the decision on what's ethical? How does an engineer decide what's ethical? So recognizing that the potential for AI, what the work at the OECD, just as an example, did is to say, how do you develop a set of high-level principles for responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI? Again, what are the properties of a system to gain trust? And it's got to be high level to make sure that the development and deployment of AI can be directionally correct, but not to restrain its innovation. So now that the principles are out there and they've been adopted by the most number of governments in the world, moving from principles to practice, the OECD is now gathering evidence through an observatory to make sure that this information can be available to everyone. The information will be analyzed to put together a broad framework that can then be guided, that can be used to guide actions of implementers, policymakers, consumers of the technology, civil society, etc. Can there be a holistic framework? We're in the middle of that bit. So data is a necessary but not sufficient resource. And there are some really basic technical issues in terms of how do you actually, I think this goes back to some of the semantic web issues, which you're much more familiar with, but some of those issues are needed. So I want to end with an echoing what Bettina has put on the table, which is in order to achieve these web futures, I think we all need to think global, but act local. Everyone is needed, so reach out, but act. I really look forward to working with everyone to come to some concrete actions, because we do need to build up that evidence base of multi-stakeholderism, interdisciplinary, a systems view of the world in order to shape the future. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Can we find specific problems that we can work together on? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. This is great. These are many great questions. I wondered, you mentioned quite a couple of ongoing initiatives or initiatives that have been going for 20 years, like internet governance. Do you have some sort of blueprints of how to make these successful, or have you collections? So if we identify issues, let's take the tracker applications, yeah? And can we learn from these past experiences that you mentioned, what to do, what not to do in order to target the next challenge? And what we know, there will always be a next challenge. There will always be hard problems that we will encounter and that we cannot foresee now.
Sure. So one thing that we learned from the internet governance discussion, as I mentioned in my comments, is it's really important and it's really essential to bring everyone to the table. And then it's very hard to have an absolute answer because everything is context dependent. And so, in terms of the contact tracing, I think part of the question is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And for whom are you trying to solve it? And I think having what's really interesting in the work that I've done is my engineering training says you don't do anything until you have a clear problem statement. But in the policy domain, coming to an agreement on what that problem statement is and what success look like is a major part of that starting point, because often you just say contact tracing, but for what purpose? So I think the internet governance discussion has shown us the importance of getting to the right starting point, or an appropriate starting point with everyone.
Yeah, that's a very good example. Yeah, I think in Germany now we have a tracing app which is for the individuals, but not for the medical doctors. And some people envision it would be more for the public health officials rather than the individuals. Yeah, but these are like trade-offs that one can achieve. There are a couple of questions popping up now. First one, Ian Brown, you mentioned an observatory. Can you say more about this observatory? I think it was about the AI observatory.
Sure. So the AI Observatory is an initiative at the OECD. What the OECD have, and you can just look at it, it's just OECD.ai. And when the OECD completed and launched its principles, what they realized was that they needed a platform to enable and facilitate dialogues with everyone at the table in order to move from principles to practice. So that's the role of the observatory. It has information on it in terms of what governments around the world have implemented in terms of AI. It will have information on it as with respect to what are some of the implementations to address the values of the AI principles. It has real live information on it in terms of what are the research? So this is information that Microsoft contributed from the Microsoft Academic Graph. What are all the related research to AI? What do the network of researchers look like? Why is this interesting? So that governments, when they're looking at this information, can say, where are the collaborations? Where are the networks of collaborations? How much information is being published from from the research funding? And then there's also an interesting bit which is contributed from LinkedIn in terms of the LinkedIn economic graph that shows skills migration. So the notion is there's a lot of information up there, and what they would like to see is to encourage further contribution of information, again, to enable and drive collaboration as well as evidence-based policy making.
Okay, that's a great example. There's one person in the audience who is a bit skeptical about the multi-party access, saying like, what if some of the participants in these discussions are not that benevolent, right? We see that not all national actors, for example, are always benevolent, and how do you deal with them at the table?
Great question, and it's and very difficult one, right? Because what you're asking is, I think it goes back to the earlier question on how do you define benevolent? What's benevolent? And it's the same question as, how do you define ethics? What's ethical, right? And I think that, one of the things is to understand the different perspectives that are out there, and then to identify what do you want the world to look like? What do you want this particular system to look like, and what should it do? I think the notion and the value of having different stakeholders at the table also is to identify unintended consequences as well, and to be aware, right? So the flip side of having people who don't agree with you at the table is to also understand what this technology can be used for and how to address those uses.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn, for your statement so far. I also will see more from you. It's very interesting, very intriguing. Let us now get to the fourth speaker, the fourth panelist.
Steffen?
Sorry.
Steffen, do you want to handle the questions later? I would otherwise type something in between.
So I think we have answered the ones that are in the Q&A. I have not tracked the chat
and
now.
then maybe I see different things. It's okay. I'm going to type something and see what happens. Just go on with Nosh. Okay? Thank you.
Nosh, it's your turn. I look forward to your statement. Nosh, I think you have to switch on your audio.
Yep. Thank you again for giving me an opportunity to be part of this panel. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot already, and it's been very stimulating, both in terms of the comments made by the presenters, as well as many of the questions that we are receiving on the Q&A and the chat. What I want to do, as you can see from the change on my backdrop, I want to, first of all, I want to start by commending the manifesto. I was there for most of the discussions in Darkstuhl, and I think that the manifesto has done an incredible job of having breadth and depth in looking at these issues. And I would say that something that I would underscore is that it talks both about the future of the web and the future of web science. And to take that on is a very modest challenge, and it's done a really good job of it. So I certainly recommend everyone take a look at that at manifesto. What I'm going to focus today mostly is on an issue that I think is implicit in the report in many places, but I'd like to sort of focus a little bit more on it, and that is the web science and the changing nature of work in particular. I'll start with some general comments and then focus a little bit on that as well. So we all understand that web science is about how society shapes the web and how web shapes society. That goes without saying. The problem is when we use the phrase, the web, we tend to slip into this notion that it is a static thing, but in fact, it is a constantly changing phenomena, and we do pick it up at certain points in time, but when we are reflecting on it, we tend to again go back into this notion of a static idea of what the web may be at that particular point in time. And if the web were like a spacecraft, we are building the spacecraft and rebuilding it while writing in it at the same time. And so it's a really tricky issue to do. And one way in which I want to talk about to sort of compartmentalize two aspects of what I want to share here is web is both the object of study and it's also a means to study social behavior. So if I want to start with the object of study, one of the reasons why I think the social sciences is such an important part of what we need to do in the context of web. And Steffen made reference to the fact that my undergraduate degree was in electrical engineering, and since then I moved into social sciences. There was a recent meme that went on the web that said, if you're an undergraduate and you want to solve the world's problems, go learn computer science. And if you are looking at graduate school and you want to solve the problems that computer science created in the world, then learn philosophy, law, and the social sciences. So that sort of gives you a sense that this has to be an interdisciplinary approach to look at these issues. Take one example of something that's happening in the changing nature of work, and that is, and it's already been referenced a couple of times in our panel, and that is what I would call human agent teaming, human autonomy teaming. The ability to recognize that technologies are no longer just a means to help us accomplish what we want. It's not just a means of communicating with each other or collaborating. It actually is now at the point where we are looking at them as autonomous agents who would be members on a team just like us. Warren Bennis, who has passed on, was a very famous management science guru who spent a lot of time at the University of Southern California. He wrote decades ago, he said, the future factory will have a man and a dog. The man will feed the dog, and the dog will make sure that the man doesn't go anywhere near the machines or the robots. So he was talking about a world which would be entirely, essentially, associated with robots. We know that's not true. We know that today humans and machines are going to be working together. And what is interesting about looking at this is that it's not just how humans are going to interact with the robots. But in fact, some work that we have been involved in right now, along with my colleague Malte Young, who's at Cornell University, has shown unequivocally that some of the most interesting social dynamics is when you put a robot as a teammate along with two humans, it's the interaction between the two humans that gets changed by the presence of a robot. A robot that might show favoritism towards one human invites the wrath of the other human, for example. So there are all these interesting dynamics that we have to study. The other part, of course, in addition to in the nature of work is not just robots, but cognitive tools like AI tools, and IBM Watson comes to mind. And one of the things about that we've learned already is that when when IBM has had struggles sometimes convincing doctors to use IBM Watson, and one of the reasons they don't want to use it, the pushback from the doctor is, I wish that when it makes a recommendation of a diagnosis, for example, it tells us why it's making the recommendation. One doctor joked that what IBM Watson needs is the why button. That'll tell me exactly why it is. Of course, we know today that a lot of what goes on in the field of explainable AI, et cetera, is about trying to help us understand why AI is making the recommendations and the decisions it does. That said, I'm not entirely convinced that we have to have a why button for everything. And this is where we come into the conversation of trust that we've already talked about at some length. For example, one of the things that we know is that when we go to a lot of people in society, we trust them. We take their word on it. We're not constantly asking every human being the why button for everything. We may when we were kids, but we don't anymore. And why is it then that we should impose on machines a different standard than what we impose on other humans that we trust? I'm not saying that we should always trust them. I'm not saying that explainable AI is not important, but we need to explore the balance of to what extent are we now in a position where we are going to have different standards of transparency, interpretability versus trust in this area. And I think that in terms of switching to the second part of it, so far what I've talked about is web as the object of study. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about web as a means to study social behavior. Back almost a decade ago, Duncan Watts said the social sciences have finally found their telescope on the web, that we now have the kind of data, ability to get data, which physicists and astronomers and other physical sciences have had previously, but we didn't have it, whether it was the microscope or the telescope, etc. But to the large extent, what we've been dealing with so far and what we call various forms of new emerging forms of data are really, for the most part, what we would call found data. That is data that was not designed, we didn't instrument the workplace. We found it by accident. It's the digital exhaust data that we've been dealing with. The Financial Times said, that's not data sharing, that's data shedding. We just see what sheds from the animal and then try to study that, etc. And today we're in a position where we are in fact instrumenting the workplace. A lot of the kinds of tools we're using provide us automatic ways of understanding, not just when we use tools like the one we're using right now, or Microsoft Teams or enterprise social media more generally, we have the ability to take that data and use it not just for the purpose of interacting, but glean insights about that. One of the projects that I've been involved in now is we wrote an article in Harvard Business Review last year about people analytics. And one of the things that we're learning is that we can use all the interactions that we're doing digitally to get new insights into things like diversity and inclusion, like equity. There was another study, not by me, but another study that was published recently in Harvard Business Review, where they asked men and women to wear sensors at work, the badges. And what they found was that their hypothesis was that men and women would act differently. But in fact, what they found was that men and women acted the same, but they were treated differently by other people. These are insights that are not directly about the web, but are ways in which the web is helping us to understand insights about general social behavior. Clearly today, you know, in the COVID-19, as was pointed out previously, we are now in a position to ask questions that we could never have asked previously. Imagine doing a beta test at scale where you asked the entire world to go into lockdown mode. So now we are able to answer social questions that we were not able to answer previously. And so we need to think about ways in which we can leverage these insights in some ways, et cetera. And it's not just the new data that we're getting, but it's also the methods. Going back to this issue of using computational social science methods of AI and ML as part of web science. One of the things that I would ask us to be cautious about is that while AI and ML is really making a lot of advances in terms of making prediction, the sciences, the social sciences have spent a lot of time also emphasizing the importance of explanation. Why is something happened rather than just the prediction? And I think that from a social science point of view, we don't need to sacrifice explanation at the altar of prediction. We need to think about this from a larger point of view. All the kind of data we're talking about obviously raises big issues of privacy that has been brought up in the manifesto. I agree with The Atlantic, an article in The Atlantic which says that privacy is the climate change of the internet. It's an invisible collective threat whose risk grows with each data emission. And so I think in closing, what I will just say is that as we study the web and as we look at the next decade of web science, we must be reminded of an important insight, and that is we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nosh. I couldn't agree more about the last remark, especially. I think that's proven again and again. There are some interesting comments on the Q&A. Maybe you also see them. One mentions that a word by Jan LeCun, that in the case of AI, the artifact is ahead by the theory just as a steam engine was made before the laws of thermodynamics got developed. Is that the case?
Yes, in fact, it's very interesting. There's a book written by Henderson which says that science owes more to the steam engine than the steam engine owes to science, and that there is really a lot of ways in which we build and then we study, and again, this is part of what I meant by saying that we are living in the situation where we are building it while we are writing in it, etc. And we have to recognize that, and we have to understand. So I couldn't agree more with Aniruddha, and I would recommend the book by Henderson that talks about looking at the sort of symbiotic relationship between, if you may, science and engineering, etc. So thank you for that question.
The second question by Ian: self-driving cars are being held to much higher standard than human drivers, it seems. So we may be dealing with a psychological distrust versus an emotional evaluation of the performance of the driving systems.
Yes, Ian, again, very good point there. I think that one of the things that we have to also study, and we are involved in a couple of projects that are looking at this, but certainly the Army is very interested in looking at autonomy, human autonomy teaming more generally, is to what extent are we taking into account how much an autonomous agent should trust a human, or an autonomous agent should trust another autonomous agent. Most of us tend to focus on, it's very human-centric in the way we think about it, how much we trust a robot, how much we trust a self-driving car, but to what extent do we program or do we embed into these autonomous agents that we are creating the ability to trust us? We are not all benevolent, to use a term that was used earlier. We all have, some of us have a lot of various ways of looking at it. And so what I would say in that particular context is that we really need to take seriously Ian's observation there and think more creatively about trust in a way that encompasses a lot of different notions, what I call a multidimensional network, where some of the agents are humans and some may be robots, some may be AI, cognitive embodiments, etc. And that's something that, again, the social sciences can play an important role in helping.
Is this a hand being shown by Bettina? Yes, please, jump in.
I'd just like to add some comments to the autonomous car remark. I think that's a very good example of how much more complex these questions are than meets the eye. The argument, well, we don't trust these cars as we do humans, I think would come back to the question, aren't they safer overall? Or we would not let an autonomous car drive if it ever killed a human, whereas we would let people drive if there have been people killing other humans. And that's a very consequentialist reasoning streak. And I'm not saying this is wrong, but I'm saying there's a lot more to autonomous driving and the ethical issues around autonomous driving than consequentialist evaluations. And so I think that should really be a bigger debate about why we have this trust or not trust, why we have a problem with an autonomous car being imperfect and imperfect.
Tina, could you give a hint as to where the issue is that you say that's not enough to look at these consequences?
Yeah, so in a sense, you're asking whether an autonomous car should actually take the autonomy away from the driver. That's one part. So does it make the driver, in a sense, does it take away human agency? Does it take away human autonomy? And is that allowed? That would be one question. Then on what basis are decisions being made? Are they being made in a way that maybe weighs one human life against another, like this infamous moral machine experiment? And how do autonomous cars change the nature of traffic? So there's a whole lot more aspects to be thought of than just how many people die in traffic. And
well, I never quite understand these arguments. I mean, I know, for example, according to German law, you're not supposed to weigh lives against each other. And what I said, my answer to that always is, people just decide not to look. As soon as I close a hospital, I delay the transfer to hospital where someone can be treated, and maybe that's the difference between living or dying in case of a heart attack. As soon as you decide to have so and so many people with the police, with the firefighters, with the doctors, you make decisions that affect humans' lives. You might just not want to you might just not want to look what kind of decision you've taken. And so in a way, I often find these arguments that we cannot just argue consequentially, rather that let's just not look there, and then we don't have a question or don't have a problem.
Well, one of the things, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Please jump in. Yeah.
Jump in, please.
I was just going to say that one of the things that, people who study self-driving cars have said for a long time is that if we could just have a turnkey system where there would be no human drivers and only self-driving cars, then everyone would be very safe again. The number of accidents would fall dramatically. It would require something as dramatic as COVID for us to suddenly have a turnkey system where the whole world suddenly says they're going to have no human drivers and only self-driving cars. And so I think part of the challenge we face is in this hybrid mode, which I think is reality. And I'm not suggesting we switch to the entirely self-driving car, but there are many in the self-driving car industry who say that the problem is not the self-driving car, it's the human in many cases. And again, maybe a bit flip, but it's still the challenge that we have to work through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I just had a paper published yesterday about self-driving cars, so maybe that's why I'm charging in here. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, so there are currently no questions in the chat, but Fabien.
Yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity to try to link together some of the subject the three of the panelists have been talking about. So we heard the suggestion about observatory, we heard about the need for interdisciplinarity, and we also need the call for involving social scientists. So one other thing I just wanted to say that as soon as we started to talk about observatory at the Dutch Touch seminar, it was really clear that there was, on one side, there was a need for observatory of what AI would do on the web, but on the other side, there was a need for AI to tool these observatories. So there was, from the beginning, there was a tension of putting more AI to make this observatory feasible, and at the same time, needing this observatory to actually monitor AI. And that also led to the question of whenever you add AI to the web, you create new problems, but you also bring very old and very well-known problem of AI that still haven't been solved, and that are multiplied by the scale of the web. So let me give you a concrete example. In the 70s, there was an expert system called MySyn. And if you look at the results of MySyn in terms of medical domain, they were quite good. The prediction of MySyn were good, but it was never used. And if you look at the evaluation reports, there are several aspects in this evaluation report, but you find problem of human-computer interaction, because the interface of MySyn, let's face it, was terrible. Problem of accountability, that was the core problem. They didn't, if one data system was taking a bad decision, they didn't know who would get sued already at the time. And in addition to that, already at the time, with that monolithic and disconnected system, there was a call for interdisciplinarity. So in addition to the interdisciplinarity we always advocated to web science, we are adding all of these together. And so I agree completely with Noshir when he talks about social scientists, but I would also say that one of the problems comes also from the fact that we may not be importing the entire part of AI. Maybe the problem also comes from the part we are importing sub-domains of AI. So for instance, there are domains in AI, such as multi-agent systems, in which the fact that an agent cannot be trusted, or the fact that we have to exchange between agents, that the beliefs are different between them, are modeled But we're not talking at all about these multi-agent systems right now. Well, and so I completely agree with the call for interdisciplinarity, but it also applies to subdomain of AI. And I think there are a lot of element of answers in that.
I mean, what I found different with what Carolyn talked about than what, at least at what I understood the Web Observatory before, it was more an observatory of what's going on. But I understood to Carolyn that you include that, but you also include like all the ways how you tackle the problem. What are the kind of cases for solving a problem, given the data, the actors involved. So it's really like a full picture of from the data to the people to the methods that you involved. I find a unique aspect that I haven't really seen before. Maybe I have overlooked it. But that's maybe something that we still lack in the field of web science, to have this really comprehensive look at the problem. Is there a best way to achieve that, Carolyn?
I don't know that, you know, there is a best way to achieve it. You know, in the policy domain, we always talk about what are some of the good practices, because again, best depends on what problem you're trying to solve, right? In this particular case, as you mentioned with the AI observatory that I referred to, the idea is very much about, look, we know that there are some problems out there. So let's gather information about where the problems may be. Because as long as there is sufficient information, there's sufficient evidence, sufficient data on what the problems are, then that can help us to the point where we can say, okay, these are the areas, and then there are different tools to address the problems. And I think that's the second part. That's this another stage of it. And clearly, as others have mentioned before, this is an ongoing process. And I think that you know, it's about identifying, you know, here's a problem, but it's not just technology is a solution, or you know, a policy or a regulation or a standard. You know, it's not that. It's that there is a toolbox, if you will, using the broader term of the toolbox, and that's where we need different people at the table. And then when you come in and when you've solved that, you will inevitably create others. So it becomes, you know, if you will, an ongoing cycle. Mm-hmm. And I think that particular approach appeals for that particular problem, because it says that, look, everyone has a role in defining the solution. It's not about saying, here's something, and then you have to go and learn how to use it, which is the approach that's normally taken from a technical perspective. Right, to say, here's what it is, just go use it. And if you can't use it right, that's your problem, kind of a thing. It's very, it takes a more collaborative and trying to say, what are the issues? What do we need to look at? And if we bring this discussion back to, you know, something concrete, right? One of the elements, you know, one of the, my things in my closing statement is, just because you can develop something doesn't mean you should. And so as we look forward at the world of work, where we know that, you know, digital skills and a lot of the computer science oriented and analytics are needed, how does this additional dimension to say, just because you can doesn't mean you should, how is that, how do you increase that sense? And because, for example, you know, just to bring the problems down, like one of the issues that we have with, you know, with respect to our engineers, especially for a company that develop platform tools, where we don't really know how people are going to use this technology that's going to be put out there, is, what does fairness mean? Right? And so does it mean that, you know, as much as we can put the information out there as to what's going on, because fairness is completely dependent on the context? I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of that paper about, you know, sort of the 50 definitions of fairness.
Yeah, there are two questions for you, Carolyn. I mean, one is more a comment that relates the AI observatory more to astronomy observatories with data and tools than the web observatory, which was rather about linked data for reuse. And the second is by Lucy Huberman. How would you create a common language for the people using the toolbox? So if you mentioned that it's not just a problem of the users that they should deal with the problem of learning the toolbox. I mean, how do you enable people to participate?
Yeah, on that last question, Madeleine Ellish put a paper out, I think it was 3 years ago, on something called the human crumple zone. And what she said there, I mean, her basic notion is to say, you know, in this conversation about human-robot interaction, is there sufficient information for the human to act? Or is it that, you know, going back to the self-driving car, is it that you just throw the thing over to the human in the end and say, okay, you take care of it now? And so there is, you know, that issue to say, what should that be? And to the question of, you know, hey, should there be a common language? We should say that there should be a language that's understandable by all. And so in the work of the observatory, what we are trying to do at this point in time is to say, in this particular working group, because there's multiple working groups, what we're saying is, let's look at the implementation of AI systems out there to address these values, these issues, the principles. And is it possible then, with all of us at the table, to define what this larger toolbox, what this framework would look like? And then, you know, hopefully, because everyone has a voice in designing that toolbox or that framework, that everyone can see their part in it and how they can use it and how all the parts fit in together. That's what we're trying to do. And because it's not any one group. And I think there was an earlier question on, you know, what did we learn from the internet governance process? That's what we learned, is how do you design something where everyone feels a part of the solution, but also everyone is accountable for that part of the solution?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the process you described reminds me a little bit about some of this web standards processes that I have observed. I've never been part of the working groups there, but Fabien can tell about that. You were part of the working groups, right? And I think one of the problems of these working groups was that there were so many people who wanted to contribute their point of view, and there would still have to be one solution to come out for each of these individual standards. And one prominent member of one of the working groups once told me, you have to provide the solution when you enter the working group, otherwise there's nothing you will get out, because the process is just slowed down by so many people and their points of views that it's very hard to move other than in some micro steps which will not really change the direction. But maybe Fabien can evaluate that better, whether that's a correct statement or whether I have a mistaken view of this process.
Well, you don't have a mistaken view of the process, because there is actually, when you look at the W3C process, there is an official action that is called the member submission, which is a way by which the member proposes something even before a working group is started. So you can take a position and say, okay, guys, I believe I have a good solution for that problem. That can be an input to the working group. So that's actually acknowledge that this is possibility. And the problem you're raising is, in fact, there are two sides of the problem. I mean, there are many problems in working groups. It's really difficult activity, but either you can have two big working groups, or imagine the first meeting of the working group on HTML5 at W3C. That was a nightmare, hundreds of people for that. But you could have the opposite. You could have too few people, and that's equally dangerous, because if you don't have the right people at the table, and you're not representing some very important views on what you started looking at standardizing, you may have a big blind spot too. So having the right people at the table is clearly, and the right balance between too many and too few is really, really a big problem already at the standardization level. Yes.
So Carolyn, do you address this issue of finding the right number of people on the table, or?
That's why in my comments, one of my suggestions for research was, you know, what are the different forms of multi-stakeholder consultation? What form of multi-stakeholder consultations or an input are appropriate for what kind of output? And here I use the term multi-stakeholder rather generically, because you use the term interdisciplinary. So if we take that conversation, you know, much closer to the product development process, right? So when and how do you involve these different perspectives into a product development process as well throughout the life cycle? And I think this is a great area. And what are some of the things that you need to arm people with to be a part of this conversation? Because it's not about, as Fabien mentioned, it can break down, right? But so there are some skills here. It's not just to say, let's put everybody in a room and you know, so that was one of my research questions.
Okay, Bettina wants to give another comment to that.
It actually follows up really nicely on Carolyn's last remark. I think this is not only a question about language. What I've heard so far is very much in principle equals who have a lot of time, who just for some reason haven't found the right ways to talk to each other yet. And then how do we involve all these? But when in fact, especially in labor relations, we have huge power differentials. So I would like to get away from the robots, and I would like to move to things such as platform work. And I would really like to hear your opinion, Carolyn and Nosh, on like, how do we get a discussion going there that takes people who have the worst of jobs seriously and that makes their voice heard? And how does that fit into observatory work?
Carolyn, do you want to go first?
I think the first part of it, and this is a much broader question, I think the first part of it is firstly a recognition that the different perspectives are absolutely essential and will improve any solution to the problem at hand. That's actually, that getting to that first step is a huge effort in some domain. And with the internet governance conversation, it did take 20 years. And so I think that the next part of it, hopefully, and this is maybe my engineering background talking, is to say, are there some good cases of where these are issues and how they can be, you know, resolved? So let me leave that there. But at the very minimum, there needs to be that first recognition that expanding the participation of the conversation will lead to better results overall for everyone.
What if it doesn't? I think that's one thing we have to deal with as well. I mean, people are making a lot of profit at the moment of modern day slaves, and things wouldn't be better for them if they talked more to the slaves, let's say. So, you know, like, I want to get away from this illusion of making things better for everybody, because maybe that in some cases that wouldn't work.
So, oh, Nosh, please, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
So let me take the current issue that we're having here, which is the entire conversation around Black Lives Matter. And so I think that we can agree that additional information, additional evidence about some of the issues that has been encountered by people of color, by Blacks, by everyone at the table, can help to lead to a better conversation. And so and that's my starting point is always having a dialogue, especially with people that you don't agree with, will always lead to a better solution. And that's true in any conversation. Because unless you talk, you can't really exchange perspectives and come up with something that works overall.
I applaud your optimism, and I agree with you, Carolyn, that that can do it. I think I also share Bettina's skepticism that that's easier said than done in many cases. And I think one of the things is on a slightly adjacent response to your question, Bettina, I think that we have had very naive approaches to looking at how to anticipate and how to shape the displacement of labor in light of tools that are coming in. But I think that we need to go back historically and see that this is not the first time that automation has displaced human labor in certain ways. And there are lessons to be learned about that through those processes, et cetera. It's, there are, for example, jobs that have what they call the competencies or the 4 C's of competency: critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration. These are things that our human AI tools are not still doing that well. So there is recognition that those are the skills that I think would really be ones where we need to help with the workforce. Now, as we look at the existing workforce, someone said, yeah, you can make, politicians can make arguments that, oh, we're going to lose all these coal mining jobs. And so all we need to do is make them from doing coal mining to data mining. Easier said than done again, because there's a lot of skills that are required in these issues, et cetera. So I think that I would just advocate that we recognize that we're not facing a completely novel problem, that this is a challenge that we've had to deal with historically, and we need to spend more time looking historically at what we did right and what we did wrong, including the rise of the labor movement.
Is it a problem for the web scientist, or is it something which is above our heads?
I think it is a problem for web science, and that's exactly why I said, because, and in 2 ways, in both ways that I was talking about. It is a problem for web science because it is, it's a social science issue that is being shaped by the web, and also a social science issue that we can use to shape the web. I mean, it's somewhat disappointing that after all this time, when we think of crowd work, we think of Wikipedia as the only example, nothing against it. But there are so many more novel ways of thinking of what's going to happen to the workplace in the future. And also because the web is also part of web science because it provides us data. This goes back to the point that Carolyn was making, building up an evidentiary base. And there are lots of ways in which now the web is providing us with all kinds of new insights and data that we can use to help shape that conversation. So I do think web science is very central in this discussion.
Okay, so we have 1 minute left in our session. A final statement by each one of you. Who wants to start? Fabien, do you want to start? Final statement on this session. Is there research to be done for the web scientist, or what would be your topic that you would pick or that you want to pick next as a web scientist?
So I sort of gave it away in my last comments that I am working more and more with people from multi-agent community because I think it's one of the next step for us is to bring bridge the architecture of the web and the multi-agent systems, because they're going to bring new answers to some of the collaborative and social dimension problem we talked about. And that would be my next step.
Okay. Bettina, what is your next topic to put your energy to? I think you're still muted. You still have to unmute yourself.
Bettina, you're muted.
You're muted, Bettina.
Sorry, can someone else go next? I was just typing an answer and I need to breathe, and then I'll give you a closing.
Okay, Carolyn.
Okay.
Carolyn, would you jump in?
I think, yeah, whoops, sorry. Yeah, no, I think goes back to my, you know, if web scientists can help us to have a better model on figuring out what is the architecture of trust.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Nosh?
Well, I think that we've, again, I mentioned most of what I've been working on right now, where we think we should be going, etc. But the one thing I would add, which is not specifically what I'm doing, but I think web science needs to do, is really also, and this is brought up in the manifesto, is building capacity. I'm looking at the next generation. You know, we've been at this for a while, and I think what is exciting to me is to see the next generation of scholars, how we train them, how we shape their thinking, how they shape our thinking, which is also very important. And I think that the future of web science is really, at this point, a lot going to be driven and shaped by this next generation, and anything we can do to help work with them and is going to be very important.
Bettina?
So I think as much as I was grappling with the notion of sustainability when we were writing the manifesto, the last month have really convinced me that the search for sustainable and resilient architectures and tools and the organizational systems around them is what I want to be looking at, on the basis of the discussions about fairness, on the basis of the discussions about privacy preservation, on the basis of ethics, and of course bringing that in education and learning from those people and those students I'm working with, because they're just fantastic and they will shape the world.
Thank you very much for this outlook. I want to thank you all very, very much for a very exciting discussion about hugely important topics. Thanks a lot for joining. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steffen, for organizing this panel and for helping with the manifesto as well.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Steffen.